Okay, in this lesson, we are going to actually finally use our with spinner higher order component. Now, I mentioned before that with our with spinner component, our isLoading is going to be a true-false value that gets determined by some outside logic. Now, that logic is going to be contained within our shop page because our shop page is actually the one that knows when, technically speaking, our shop data is finished loading. Because the moment that snapshot comes back and it's converted, and then we update our reducer, at that point we know that, technically speaking, our shop page is good to render the collection object. So what we're going to do is we are going to first import in our new higher order component with spinner from components with spinner component. Now, before we do this, we need to actually figure out how we're going to set the loading value, whether it be true or false. And the best way to do that is inside of our component state. Now, in another lesson, we're going to actually put it in the reducer, but first let's just see this work inside of our own component state. So what we can do as shorthand, now we tend to use the constructor. So we've done this before where we call our constructor, we call our super, and then we call this.state equals, and then we would do a loading equals true, for example. There's actually a shorter way to do this if we don't need the constructor and all we want to set is state. We can actually just do state equals, and then loading goes to true. And the constructor and super call setup React will handle in the backend for us. This was introduced a couple versions back, and it's just a more simplified way so that we don't have to write constructor super every time. React will know that if you're in a class component and you write a state property like so at the top of your component declaration, that you probably are just invoking state. So it will, under the hood, invoke the super for us so that we can actually leverage the state value. And now that we have our state, we are just going to make sure that after our update collections is called, we'll just call this.setState where loading equals false. Now that we have our loading Boolean value as well as determining where in the logic that it will fire, we have to figure out how to use our with spinner higher order component that we just made. Now, as we know, our with spinner is a higher order component that takes a component as an argument and gives us back a spinner component that will render the component we passed in when the loading is false. So we have to actually make that component first and then pass this new component we get out of our higher order component, our isLoading property, and then render it in the place where we would originally have rendered our passed in component. So if that sounds confusing, don't worry, we will write it out and we will see what that's like. Now, the two places where we know on this component tree that we'll need to know whether or not the loading is true or false will be obviously our two route components. These two components right now just render their respective components, when in reality, they need to be aware of whether or not the loading is still happening. So what we can do here is declare a new component called collection overview with spinner. And this will be equal to us calling with spinner and passing in our collections overview. Now, as we know, this will give us back a new component wrapped around the component that we passed in. And using this new component, we can just pass this component the loading value. And we'll do the same thing for our collections page, and we'll see how we'll use this. So we'll make a collection page with spinner equal to with spinner, and then passing in the collection page. And now we have our collections overview with spinner component. We just need to render it inside our route and pass it the loading prop on our state. So how we'll do this is actually, instead of using this component value, we can actually use the render value. And render is a method that takes a function where the parameters in the function are pretty much just the parameters that the component will receive, which in our case are going to be the match location and history props that our route passes into our component, which is what gives, in fact, our collection page access to the match object that we use inside of our selector, which we pull off of own props. So because this function will be getting it, we have to make sure to pass those properties, right, those match history and location props, down into our component. And what we do here is we just render in our new collection overview with spinner component. We set this is loading value here. And then what we'll do is we will spread in the other props. Oops. And first, what we're going to do is we are going to just destructure off the loading value from our state. And then we'll just pass it in. And we'll do the exact same thing for our collection page. And similarly, is loading goes to loading. And then we'll just spread in the props. And now, if we go back to our application, we'll see that there's that spinner that loads while our component is fetching the backend data. The moment it comes back and updates the reducer, it flips the loading to false, which then renders our actual final component. We'll see this works for our collections page, but we'll see this also works for our shop page. And there we see our spinner component. And with that, we have now used and built our loading component. So now this pattern that we have here, we can leverage in any place where we need some asynchronous data from the backend before we initialize the actual components that we need. Now, I know maybe it's a little bit confusing, but if you watch these videos a couple times, this higher order component pattern will make a lot of sense because there's going to be a lot of projects out there that leverage this higher order component pattern of wrapping components and returning other components to extend and reuse functionality, just like we did with our with spinner component. Now, I know it's confusing. For me, when I first learned it, it was really confusing. But now it makes more sense because the more you look at it and the more you practice, it will all click. And that's all it comes down to. I promise you, the more practice you have with it, the more you'll see how to use and leverage this higher order component pattern. Okay, so just like that, our application is now wired with our backend. We've built in our backend into our application. And now if we were to say update our backend with anything, right, with a new document object, or we were to add values in here, our crown clothing application will update accordingly. We don't have to worry about handling any of that information on our front end code. All of that is now separated into a backend, just like a real life application will be. So you now understand how real life code works when it comes to building a front end application where it leverages data on a backend.